January 1944. A cold morning settles over a fenced compound in the American Southwest. Inside a long wooden barracks, Japanese prisoners of war sit in disciplined silence. Their uniforms are worn. Their boots are dusted with the pale sand of an unfamiliar land. For weeks, their days have followed the same pattern roll call, labor details, meals eaten without conversation. Many still believe capture is a living disgrace. Some expect interrogation. Others punishment. The door opens, but the men who step inside are not guards. They carry no rifles. No rank insignia. One holds a stack of books. Another adjusts wire-rimmed glasses, squinting at the dim light. Their clothes are civilian. Their posture unhurried. Their voices calm. The prisoners exchange glances. This is not what captivity was supposed to look like. A chalkboard is leaned against the wall. A notebook is opened. An American introduces himself not as an officer but as a professor. He speaks slowly, choosing words carefully, as if addressing a classroom rather than enemy soldiers. Confusion spreads through the room. Suspicion follows close behind. Why would a nation at war send educators into a prison camp? That question, unspoken but shared, hangs in the air because the answer would quietly reshape how this war would end and how its enemies would return home. The scene opens outward, toward the forces that made this moment possible. By the time Japanese prisoners began arriving on American soil in significant numbers, the Pacific War had already hardened into a conflict unlike any the United States had previously fought. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, shattered assumptions. It transformed Japan overnight from a distant power into a personal enemy. Across the Pacific, the war unfolded with an intensity shaped not only by weapons and strategy, but by culture. Battles were rarely decided by surrender. They ended with annihilation. On islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Guadalcanal, American troops learned quickly that Japanese units fought to the last man. Prisoners were rare. Those taken alive were often wounded, unconscious, or physically unable to continue fighting. This was not accidental. Imperial Japan's military doctrine had spent decades erasing the idea of surrender. Rooted in a selective interpretation of Bushido and reinforced through state education, the Japanese soldier was taught that capture was worse than death. To be taken alive meant dishonor not only to oneself, but to family, ancestors, and the emperor. Training manuals made this explicit. Officers reinforced it relentlessly. By the early 1940s, surrender had been framed not as survival, but as betrayal. American forces encountered this mindset almost immediately. Interrogations revealed prisoners who refused to give their names. Others claimed they were already dead. Some attempted suicide inside field hospitals or holding pens. Many believed they would be tortured or executed by their captors, because that was what they had been taught Americans did. Yet reality intruded in unexpected ways. As the war progressed through 1942 and 1943, the United States found itself holding a small but growing population of Japanese prisoners. Early numbers were low hundreds rather than thousands, but each POW presented a puzzle. These men were not hardened criminals. They were indoctrinated soldiers, suddenly removed from a worldview that had promised either victory or death, but nothing in between. The Geneva Convention of 1929 technically governed their treatment, though Japan itself had not fully ratified its provisions. The United States, however, chose to adhere to its standards. Prisoners were fed adequately. They received medical care. They were housed far from combat zones. Many eventually transferred to camps in the continental United States for security and logistical reasons. This alone caused shock for many Japanese POWs. America did not resemble the barbaric enemy described by wartime propaganda. Camps were orderly. Guards were firm but largely professional. Violence was not routine. Food, while unfamiliar, was sufficient. Letters from home were permitted under strict censorship. Some prisoners began to realize they were not about to be executed. That realization, however, created a deeper problem without the constant pressure of combat or command. Discipline inside the camps became unstable. Prisoners who still believed in imperial doctrine exerted pressure on those who showed signs of adaptation. Loyalty groups formed. Informal tribunals punished men who spoke too openly with guards or accepted American customs. Suicides and assaults occurred within the wire. Driven by shame and ideological policing rather than mistreatment, American camp commanders reported confusion. These prisoners were physically captive but psychologically still at war. Traditional punishment only deepened resistance. Isolation reinforced radical beliefs. Something was missing, something that weapons, rules, and fences could not provide. By late 1943, U.S. intelligence officers and psychologists began submitting reports that shared a quiet but radical conclusion. The problem was not discipline. It was belief. And belief, they argued, could not be broken by force alone. That insight would push American planners toward an unconventional solution, one that would challenge not only Japanese prisoners, but American assumptions about what war demanded. The shift would not come from the battlefield, but from classrooms that had not yet been built. By early 1944, the United States War Department faced a dilemma it had not anticipated when the Pacific War began. Japanese prisoners of war were not behaving like previous enemy captives. They were not passive. They were not compliant in predictable ways. And they were not easily reshaped by traditional camp discipline. Reports from Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Papago Park in Arizona, and several Texas installations described the same pattern: obedience to orders on the surface, ideological rigidity beneath it. The prisoners followed rules. They marched. They worked. But many still clung to the belief that surrender had erased their identity. This made them vulnerable to radicalization inside the camps themselves. Hardline prisoners enforced silence, punished curiosity, and maintained loyalty to an emperor who was now half a world away. American officers realized that captivity alone was not neutralizing the enemy. In some cases, it was preserving him. At the same time, the United States was already thinking beyond victory. Planning staffs in Washington were looking ahead to a post-war Japan I that would inevitably have to be occupied, governed, and rebuilt. Millions of Japanese soldiers would eventually return home. Many would carry their wartime beliefs with them. The question was no longer just how to guard prisoners, but what kind of men they would become once the war ended. This concern led to a quiet policy shift. Instead of focusing solely on containment, the War Department authorized what it called reorientation programs. The term was carefully chosen. This was not forced propaganda. There would be no loyalty oaths, no public renunciations of the emperor. Participation would be voluntary. At least in principle, the goal was narrower and more ambitious at the same time: expose prisoners to factual information, democratic systems, and the idea that authority could be questioned without punishment. To do this, the military turned to civilians. Universities were contacted. Professors of history, political science, economics, and sociology were recruited, many already working in government research or wartime advisory roles. Some spoke Japanese. Others relied on interpreters. They were given strict guidelines: avoid humiliation, avoid coercion, avoid emotional manipulation. Teach but do not preach. The choice of educators was deliberate. Soldiers in uniform represented authority and force. Professors represented something else: argument, inquiry, evidence. The War Department believed that if Japanese prisoners were to confront contradictions in their worldview, it would happen more effectively in a classroom than an interrogation room. Classes were held inside the camps. Barracks were converted into makeshift lecture halls. Chalkboards were installed. Textbooks were translated or simplified. Subjects ranged from American history and constitutional law to basic economics, world geography, and journalism. Some courses addressed Japan directly, using neutral language and verified facts: industrial capacity, population statistics, war developments already known through censored channels. The response was uneven. At first, attendance was sparse. Many prisoners feared retaliation from fellow captives. Others assumed the classes were a trap. But over time, curiosity grew. Word spread that these sessions did not involve punishment or humiliation, that questions were allowed. That disagreement was tolerated. By mid-1944, some camps reported hundreds of participants. Study groups formed. Prison newspapers began circulating, carefully monitored but largely written by prisoners themselves. A few inmates, former students before the war, emerged as translators and assistants. This was not transformation in the dramatic sense. There were no sudden conversions. But something subtle was happening. Prisoners began to speak in conditional terms rather than absolutes. They asked about elections. They debated responsibility. They argued among themselves not about loyalty, but about facts. American intelligence officers took notice. What began as an experiment was becoming a strategic tool, one that operated quietly, without spectacle and without violence. Inside those barracks, the war was being fought in a new way. To understand its full impact, the story must be seen from several angles, each revealing a different truth about captivity, belief, and power. Human angle. Confusion inside the wire for the Japanese prisoner. The classroom was an emotional minefield. Many had been raised to believe that capture erased honor. Sitting at a wooden bench, pencil in hand, listening to an enemy explain history felt unnatural, almost dangerous. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared at the floor. A few refused to enter the room at all, convinced participation would mark them as traitors, yet confusion slowly replaced fear. The professors did not shout. They did not demand confessions. They asked questions. When prisoners answered, even critically, they were not punished. For men conditioned to obedience, the absence of immediate consequences was disorienting. Over time, a small number began to speak more freely. They asked about American elections, about why factory workers could strike, about whether newspapers were truly independent. These were not academic curiosities. They were tests probing for deception. What unsettled many prisoners most was consistency. The explanations given in class matched what little information filtered in from censored news reports. There was no dramatic contradiction, no obvious propaganda flourish. The enemy's narrative, however unwelcome, appeared coherent. That coherence forced a personal reckoning. If America was not the chaotic, immoral society they had been taught to despise, then what else might have been exaggerated? Cultural angle, authority without violence. Imperial Japan's wartime education relied on hierarchy. Knowledge flowed downward. Questioning was discouraged. Loyalty mattered more than accuracy. In contrast, the American classroom inside the camp operated on a different premise. Authority could be challenged, even corrected. This was not accidental. Professors were instructed to allow debate. They openly admitted uncertainty when they lacked information. In some cases, they corrected their own mistakes in front of the class. For Japanese POWs, this behavior carried unexpected weight. Authority figures who acknowledged error contradicted everything they had experienced in uniform. The impact was subtle but cumulative. Prisoners began to differentiate between respect and fear, between obedience and agreement. These distinctions had not existed clearly in their military lives. Psychological angle. Decompression after indoctrination. Psychologists observing the camps noted a pattern. Once prisoners realized they would not be punished for curiosity, emotional pressure began to ease. Nighttime arguments decreased. Loyalty groups lost influence. Men who had previously isolated themselves started attending classes together, forming study circles that replaced ideological policing with discussion. This did not mean belief vanished. Many prisoners remained loyal to the emperor and deeply ashamed of surrender. But the mental rigidity that had once defined their identity began to soften. They were no longer performing loyalty constantly. In that space, reflection became possible. American observers understood the significance. Indoctrination had compressed identity into a single dimension: obedience. Education was allowing it to expand again, slowly, unevenly. But PARCEPTIBLY. And as these changes unfolded inside the wire, American planners began to view the program not as an experiment but as leverage. The remaining angles would reveal how this quiet shift affected strategy, leadership, and the enemy beyond the camps themselves. Technological and media angle, information as infrastructure inside the camps. Education was supported by carefully controlled tools. Maps were pinned to walls, updated as the war progressed. Newspapers, edited and translated, were distributed under supervision. Short documentary films were screened, showing American factories, farms, and civic life. None of it was sensational. That was the point for Japanese posts accustomed to state-curated information. The sheer volume of verifiable data was disorienting. Industrial statistics matched production realities. Casualty figures aligned with rumors from the front. Even unfavorable American news labor strikes, political disagreements, was sometimes acknowledged. This consistency lent credibility to the broader message that disagreement and transparency were not signs of weakness. Information became infrastructure. It supported discussions that no lecture alone could sustain. Prisoners began cross-checking facts, arguing over sources, debating interpretations. These were not scripted outcomes. They were emergent behavior signs of intellectual agency returning, leadership angle, planning beyond the war behind the wire. American leadership watched closely. Reports flowed from camp commanders to the Office of War Information and Military Intelligence. The question was not whether education softened prisoners. It clearly did, but whether that softening mattered strategically, planners believed it did. A Japan that surrendered would not simply demobilize. It would be occupied. Millions of soldiers would return to a shattered society. If even a fraction of them had been exposed to alternative ways of thinking without coercion, they could become stabilizing influences rather than sources of unrest. This was not humanitarian idealism. It was calculated foresight. Education was cheaper than force, more durable than fear. And unlike propaganda, it left prisoners believing they had reached conclusions themselves. Enemy. Angle. The long shadow of return, the most sensitive angle, lay beyond the camps. What would happen when these men went home? Japanese authorities had long portrayed posts as dishonored or corrupted. Some prisoners knew they might face suspicion or silence upon return. That fear made the classroom both a refuge and a risk. Learning new ideas could deepen alienation from home, but it could also provide tools to survive defeat. American intelligence quietly tracked this dilemma. They monitored prisoner essays, discussions, and questions about postwar life. Many posts asked not how to fight again, but how to explain themselves. How to live in a country that had lost by late 1944. It was clear the program's impact would not be visible immediately. Its effects would surface later, dispersed across time and geography. The war, however, was approaching a breaking point. Events far beyond the camps would soon accelerate decisions, collapse certainties, and force these prisoners and their captors to confront the war's final, irreversible turn. That moment, when education collided with surrender, would become the story's turning point. By the summer of 1945, the war that had framed every lesson, every debate, and every silence inside the camps was reaching its violent conclusion. Across the Pacific, American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima had fallen in March, Okinawa followed in June at staggering cost. Casualty reports circulated through the camps and translated summaries, names removed, numbers intact. Japanese prisoners studied them quietly. The scale was undeniable. The homeland was no longer an abstraction. Inside the barracks-sterned classrooms, something shifted. Attendance increased. Men who had once avoided lectures now sat through them without comment. Questions changed in tone. They were no longer testing American claims for weakness. They were asking about consequences, about occupation, about what defeat would mean for Japan's institutions, its emperor, its people. American instructors noticed the change immediately. Discussions that had once circled around ideology now focused on survival. How economies recovered, how governments transitioned, how societies absorbed responsibility without collapse. Then, in August, the unimaginable happened. On August 6, 1945, News reached the camps filtered, controlled, but unmistakable. A single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The professors did not dramatize the information. They presented facts as they were known: unprecedented destruction, immediate casualties, long-term uncertainty. And there were no lectures that day. Only silence. For Japanese Post, the shock was profound. The war had been built on sacrifice, on endurance, on the belief that Japan could absorb any blow if its spirit held. Hiroshima shattered that premise. Not just militarily, but philosophically. Classes resumed cautiously. Questions were tentative. Some prisoners demanded proof. Others asked if the reports were exaggerated. American instructors shared photographs, approved by military censors, maps, timelines. There was no triumph in the presentation. Only finality. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast was summarized and translated. Many prisoners had never heard his voice before. The words, formal and restrained, confirmed what the bombs had already suggested. The war was over. Inside the camps, reactions varied. Some men wept openly. Others stared ahead, motionless. A few refused to believe it. For years, surrender had been unthinkable. Now it was unavoidable. The education programs, once peripheral, became central. Prisoners sought context. They asked what surrender meant legally, politically, historically, American. Instructors found themselves explaining not victory, but aftermath. This was the turning point. Not the bombings themselves, but the moment when Japanese prisoners realized that their future would be shaped not by resistance, but by understanding a world that had defeated them. And with that realization came a final, urgent question: what would they carry home when the wire came down? The answer would be forged in the war's final days, as the classroom became preparation for a life after empire. In the weeks that followed Japan's surrender, the prison camps entered an unfamiliar silence. There were no more casualty lists to update, no front lines to mark on maps. The war that had defined every hour of the prisoners' lives was finished. Not with a final battle they could comprehend, but with an announcement delivered through translation and paper. For the Japanese Post, the end did not bring relief. It brought exposure. Without the framework of resistance, long-suppressed questions surfaced. Who was responsible for the war? What had been hidden? What had been exaggerated? The education programs, once cautiously tolerated, now became the primary space where such questions could be asked. Without immediate reprisal, American instructors adjusted their approach. Lessons shifted from comparison to consequence, from describing American systems to explaining global responsibility. Discussions addressed war crimes tribunals, occupation policies, and constitutional reform not as threats, but as processes already underway. Some prisoners reacted with defensiveness, others with exhaustion, a smaller number with guarded curiosity. The tone of the classrooms changed again, not from indoctrination to liberation, but from belief to reckoning. U.S. intelligence officers monitored these developments closely. They interviewed prisoners nearing repatriation. They analyzed essays written in careful, restrained language. What they found was not enthusiasm for America, but a gradual abandonment of absolutism. Fewer references to sacred destiny. More acknowledgement of error, miscalculation, and consequence. This mattered. As ships were prepared to return prisoners to Japan, American planners understood that force had reached its limit. What these men would bring home could not be controlled by guards or regulations, only by what they now believed or no longer believed. The professors packed their books. Classrooms were dismantled. Chalkboards were erased. There were no ceremonies, no final speeches. The program had never been public, and it would not end publicly either, but its influence traveled quietly with the men who boarded those ships across the Pacific. Into a defeated nation struggling to understand what had happened. The climax of this story was not a battle won or lost. It was the moment when an enemy, once defined entirely by obedience, returned home carrying questions instead of orders. What followed would not be immediate, nor dramatic, but its consequences would echo through the first uneasy years of peace. Japanese prisoners of war were returned in stages, processed through ports in California and the Pacific, then shipped across an ocean that no longer carried fleets, only consequences. They arrived in a country stripped of certainty. Cities lay in ruins. Industry was paralyzed. Authority itself had been redefined by defeat. For many former posts, the return was quieter than expected. There were no tribunals waiting for them. No public denunciations. Most were absorbed back into civilian life with little acknowledgement of their captivity. Silence in post-war Japan became its own form of survival. American occupation authorities, however, were watching closely. Intelligence summaries noted that repatriated posts did not form radical resistance groups. They did not organize around grievance. In interviews conducted by occupation personnel and Japanese officials, some former prisoners demonstrated a familiarity with democratic terminology, elections, constitutions, civil rights without overt enthusiasm or hostility. This did not mean they were reformers. Many remained conservative. Many were traumatized, but they were less absolutist, less inclined to frame defeat as betrayal by fate or gods. That difference, while subtle, mattered in a society struggling to redefine itself. Inside Japan, educational reforms moved quickly. The imperial rescript on education was abolished. Textbooks were rewritten. Civics classes emphasized participation rather than obedience. For some former posts, this shift felt strangely familiar. The language echoed discussions they had once heard in American barracks. Months or years earlier, occupation reports cautiously suggested that POW education programs had reduced hostility among returnees. There were no grand claims, no declarations of success, only correlations noted in restrained bureaucratic language. In the camps themselves, the program quietly ended. Records were filed away. Professors returned to universities. Guards moved on to other assignments. The experiment never publicly celebrated. Dissolved into postwar administration. Yet its legacy was already beyond American control. Former prisoners carried fragmented memories of chalk dust, debates, maps pinned to walls, of being allowed to question without consequence. These memories did not override nationalism or grief, but they complicated them. The aftermath was not transformation. It was diffusion, and in that diffusion, American planners recognized something important. The war's final influence would not be measured in territory or tonnage, but in how defeat was understood. The longer view would only become clear with time, as Japan rebuilt and the quiet effects of captivity surfaced in unexpected ways. As the occupation of Japan settled into its second year, the presence of former prisoners of war faded into the larger struggle of national reconstruction. There were no monuments to captivity, no public discussions of classroom debates held behind American wire. For most returnees, survival meant blending in, not standing out. Yet occupation officials and Japanese educators noticed patterns that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Some former posts entered teaching. Others joined local administration or labor organizations. A few became journalists. They did not advertise their past, but in internal discussions they demonstrated familiarity with concepts that had been marginal before the war: procedural democracy, freedom of expression, civilian oversight. These were not revolutionary positions. They were practical ones. Occupation-era surveys suggested that returned posts were less likely to express nostalgia for militarism, not immune to nationalism, but skeptical of absolutist rhetoric. When confronted with claims of divine destiny or inevitable conflict, they often asked for evidence. This mattered in a fragile society where ideas competed for legitimacy. The American education program inside POW camps was never replicated on a large scale elsewhere. It had been situational, constrained, and temporary, but its principles echoed through postwar reforms: education without coercion, exposure without humiliation, information without spectacle. For American military planners, the lesson was sobering. Education could not replace force during war, but it could shape peace afterward. It worked slowly, inconsistently, without guarantees. But unlike punishment, it left fewer scars. In later internal reviews, officials noted that the program succeeded not by convincing prisoners to admire America, but by allowing them to doubt absolutes. That distinction mattered. Admiration fades. Doubt persists. As years passed, the men who had once sat in barracks classrooms grew older. Their experiences blended into broader memories of defeat and recovery. Few spoke openly about captivity. Fewer still about professors behind wire fences, but the influence endured, quietly embedded in attitudes rather than stories. The aftermath, in the end, was not a clear victory or failure. It was a subtle recalibration of how enemies understood loss, responsibility, and the possibility of rebuilding without returning to war. That recalibration would shape Japan's post-war trajectory in ways that were never fully visible but deeply consequential, and with that long shadow cast, the story turns toward its final reflection. War is usually remembered through its violence, through battles, ruins, and numbers carved into stone. But some of its most enduring effects unfold far from the front lines, in places rarely photographed or celebrated. Inside American prison camps during the final years of the Pacific War, no shots were fired. No flags were raised. Yet something irreversible occurred. Men trained to obey without question were placed in rooms where questions were permitted. Not demanded, permitted. The United States did not defeat Japan with classrooms. The war was decided by fleets, factories, and weapons of unprecedented power. But the peace that followed required something different. It required people who could live with defeat without seeking revenge, who could absorb responsibility without collapsing into myth. The POW education programs did not erase ideology. They did not create instant Democrats. What they did was quieter. They disrupted certainty. They introduced the idea that authority could be argued with, not just endured. That facts could exist independent of loyalty. For the Japanese prisoners who encountered American professors behind barbed wire, captivity became more than confinement. It became exposure to contradiction, to debate, to a world that did not end when an empire fell. History rarely records such moments. They leave no ruins, no anniversaries, but they shape what comes next. When former enemies returned home carrying questions instead of orders. The war truly ended not with surrender papers, but with the slow, imperfect work of understanding. And in that silence after the guns fell quiet, education proved to be one of the most unexpected forces of all.